It is Saturday, July the 20th, 2019. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff of Georgia. On today's show, the seductive rhetoric of the Popular Front. Yes, a little bit about the Popular Front movement of the communists in the 1930s, which I had vaguely positive feelings about before I began researching it. Now, not so much. Of course, before I get to all that, just a brief reminder that today's show, like all these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you. Listeners who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons who make it possible for me to devote the time it takes to craft a magnificent audio product for you. You can also support me at PayPal, paypal.me/distantpeasant. Links to all this shit on my Twitter at JeffHisStudentess. Tomorrow is my birthday, if you care about such things. Alright, so cards on the table. I'm not a huge fan of political labels, though I do think they have more utility than some of my comrades. I would describe myself as a socialist. That's about as specific as I like to get. If someone insists on adding a democratic to my label, that's fine with me. Most of this shit is really just a question of time horizons for me. I don't see that humanity has a ton of time to dramatically reorganize civilization before climate change and other environmental pressures force an end to the endless resource consumption required by capitalism. Indeed, they've already begun to do so. So in the short and medium term, coordinated and directed economic planning by the world's governments and states is going to be required. Now, liberals, social democrats, some anarchists, maybe even some socialists and communists might all object to this framing for different reasons, I guess, but I calls them like I sees them. And generally speaking, I'm pleased to spend some limited time discussing these distinctions, but I'm only pleased to do so to the extent that we're all on the same side. The same side. You hear that phrase a lot, usually from liberals these days. Both the good kind and the bad kind. Folks who feel they have a stake in ruling class institutions, distinct from those of the working class and their sympathizers, and distinct from those who don't quite gel with the right wing's conservative and reactionary politics. Alyssa Milano and Seth MacFarlane begging Democrats to stop attacking each other. Well, what they really mean is stop attacking Joe Biden, probably, because they're all on the same side. This is a good example. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's endless calls for caucus unity, while the future of her party, first-term congressional representatives elected by core constituencies of the extant Democratic Party's voters, cry out to please help us stop these fascists. Now, I'm far from the first to notice and remark upon the following, but it's pretty basic and simple truth to American politics. It's worth saying down. So, due to the mechanics of our first-past-the-post system at the national level, you're always going to have your two-party system, even independents of whatever stripe, caucusing with one side or the other in the end. These days, Democrats or Republicans. Now, the Republicans are actually pretty easy to understand. Party controlled wholly by the interests of capital, with its main debates about just exactly what hash and how much, culture war bullshit, ethnic cleansing, white nationalism, maybe some light whites-only welfare state payments to dole out and keep themselves on top. The Democrats are a little more complicated because they are basically described as everyone who is not on board with the other side. Some controllers of bourgeois capital, while they are very interested in preserving a system that makes them oodles of money by extracting wealth from labor and the planet, but not actually doing any work themselves, are nonetheless self-aware enough not to join a postmodern death cult like the GOP, or at least find themselves at odds with those who stand to profit the most from the collapse of our civilization. They're in the Democratic Party, along with all the working class activists, union folk, all the lawyers who aren't evil, others too. Subsequently, the Democrats aren't really a governing party in any meaningful sense. At best, they are a loose coalition of forces who, for good reasons and bad reasons, reasons admirable and not, and in many cases reasons mutually exclusive to each other, have all come to find themselves not allied with the Republicans. So, to put things plain, they aren't really all on the same side, in a class sense, or a Marxist one, if you prefer that nomenclature. They don't all want the same things, or even the same kinds of things, frankly. This is why, even though Republicans consistently work media refs into overblowing Democrats in disarray stories, these fundamental divides do remain. And what to do about that exactly is a hot topic of contention among the left. It's a tough question. It may depend on where in the United States the leftist asking the question is living and working, as to the types of opportunities that are present for them. I don't presume to settle all of this here and now. But it's all got me kind of thinking about the concept of a popular front. Specifically the popular front around the 1930s, one of the last times fascists grew in political power in many places throughout the world. So what is a popular front? What was the popular front against fascism in America? Who was in it? Is there any sort of popular front now? Should I join it or be sympathetic to it? Is this accommodationist crapola? I will do my best to poke each of these bears in turn before I go on. But 2 caveats first. First is just like the usual caution both to me and to you, dear listeners, that we should always resist the urge to draw too many direct parallels and comparisons between the people now, people 100 years ago. Now, we shouldn't be too timid about this, because if there's nothing to learn from the past, then why are we bothering with it? The second is that just because of the nature of the popular front and the time that I'm going to talk about, there were libs, socialists, communists, anarchists, just plain heterodox political weirdos. Infighting between them and among these factions will pop up time and time again and continues to this day. So depending on where your sympathies are and where you perceive mine to be, I could perhaps be accused of bias in this particular or that one, maybe. This is the sort of thing people do argue about endlessly to this day. It just comes with the territory, but you know, old Jeff in Georgia, there's nothing I love more than being fair and just. It's just more possible than usual that I might fuck it up now. Fortune favors the bold, though, so let's hop in our old time machine, beep, 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 and go back to the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, I've talked about, hopefully you know at least a little bit about the Great Depression, specifically probably the American side of this phenomenon. Kicked off as 1929 became 1930, but the Great Depression was a worldwide phenomenon. And as it began, the Communist International, also known at this time as the Third International or just the Comintern, was meeting for its 6th World Congress in Moscow in the summer of 1928. Now, Stalin's been in power for about 4 years, and it's a pretty thoroughly pro-USSR and Bolshevized organization at this time, for the record. But one thing the executive committee declares is that the world is entering a so-called third period. So, incredibly broadly speaking, these Marxist-Leninist ideological concepts go something like this. First period was right after World War I, when the revolutionary working class was suppressed and defeated. The second period was the period of capitalist consolidation, covers most of the 1920s. Concept of a third period, which Stalin is closely associated with, but he was definitely not clever enough to come up with, is that with coming economic depression and the continuing tendency for the rate of profit to fall under capitalism, capitalists would accelerate their suppression of wages, institute longer working hours, and utilize fewer employees through standardization and automation in a vain attempt to claw themselves out from this crisis of capitalism. That might sound plausible and reasonable enough to you. I confess it does to me. However, the conclusion the party preached was that the world proletarian revolution was imminent, and that social democrats, broadly speaking, liberally managed capitalism with a mixed economic model. Basically, Roosevelt's New Deal if it wasn't so racist. That's what you can think of when I say social democrat. They weren't worth dealing with. In fact, not only were they not worth dealing with, they were pejoratively described as social fascists, a slur they also appended frequently to Trotsky and any of his perceived fans. And crucially, that their vision was just a dark and necessary mirror for the existence of actual fascism, and that both of these reflections must be smashed in order to make way for communism. At the risk of being accused of inappropriate apologia, I should tell you that inside Germany, that country closely watched by much of the world's would-be revolutionaries in the late 1920s and 1930s, the leader of the Social Democratic Party of Germany denounced the Communists of Germany, and there were a goodly number of them at this time. They were the largest communist party in Europe, actually. They were just as bad as the right wing, in his view. Literally just red fascists. Any of this ring familiar to you? And had a bunch of them shot on May Day 1929. The Social Democrats were so hated, it's true, that some Reds did end up working with the Nazis in 1931 in an attempt to bring down the Prussian state Social Democrat-run government. They failed. But anyway, there's a lot of blame to go around. There was definitely nothing like any broad political front to oppose the rise of the Nazi Party. Now, relations between what we might call today liberals and the left in Germany were so bad that even after the Nazis seized power in 1933, the official communist slogan was, "After Hitler, our turn." So convinced were they that fascism would fail quickly to offer Germany a true path out of the crisis of capitalism. Well, fascism does, in its own grotesque way, offer a path through the inherent contradictions of capitalism, with violent repression, among other tools. Not so fun fact, I guess, the very first people the Nazis went after with the tools of state repression after they seized power, or to put it another way, the people that they feared the most, were communists. The little event known as the Reichstag fire that the Nazi Party used to justify the basic legal abolition of democracy in Germany was pinned on the Communist Party. Communists were brutally suppressed by the police. German courts found that membership in the Communist Party was itself a treasonous act. In the March 1933 German elections, 81 communist deputies were elected to government. They were all arrested, and the subsequent party leadership took refuge in Stalin's Soviet Union. But who gives a shit about all that? What's going on in America? Well, meanwhile, in America, the news and population and the federal government were all pretty generally preoccupied with Roosevelt's assuming office and his first 100 days. Though the papers did openly carry stories and commentary on violence against Jews and others in Germany, even if they didn't really give a shit about the communists. The American Communist Party, closely aligned with the Soviets, still of course, lost about 75% of its dues-paying members between 1928 and 1932, which the line on social fascism probably contributed to. The socialists in America, or as the Communist Party line referred to them, social fascists, weren't much better off. Though after a decline in membership, they would rebound. This rebound would bring with it new, more militant and more radical Marxists dissatisfied with Bolshevism, Trotsky fans, unaffiliated left radicals, along with an old guard who would all in short order prove impossible to keep together. However, this is really fucking important, to me at least, even as American communists refused to make common cause with non-red unions, socialists, or any kind of libs at this time, when unemployment was at its height, it was the communists who were instrumental in organizing direct actions by and behalf of the unemployed. Sit-ins, marches, defenses of evicted tenants, mass demonstrations for unemployment relief, etc. And however particular they were about the politics of the people they worked with, they were far and away the best of the left across race, gender, and ethnic lines. Communists recruited and organized black sharecroppers in the South. Workers in bigger southern cities like Birmingham, Alabama, worked to fight against lynching with both militarism and legal defense. Most famously, they took the lead in defending the incredibly innocent Scottsboro Boys, 9 black youth falsely accused of raping 2 white women. Anyway, hate them or love them, even the Bolsheviks recognized that they had fucked up. After Hitler took power in 1933, and after the communists had gotten over any delusions that fascism would quickly flare out, and that they would be swept into power in Germany, and then probably the whole world, they really began flailing about. Now, open and frank discussion among a communist party whose strategy had failed so abysmally was not really going to happen under the influence of Joseph Stalin. So for a couple years, among not just communists, but really anyone left of lib in America, about what the fuck to do about all this was an open question. Communists in America didn't actually wait that long for direction from Moscow or anyone else, and some began immediately working, at least informally, with the socialists and other worker radicals to help foment a strike wave that would eventually result in the formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Very cool. By 1934, the communists had abandoned their policy of forming red unions alongside more mainstream AFL unions, that's the American Federation of Labor, and alongside former Trotskyists, current Trotskyists, radical socialists, wobblies, and all their sympathizers. They really did help make the American labor movement strong and coordinated enough to paralyze entire industries and geographic locations. Smarties from the center to the left sometimes describe the creation of the New Deal style capitalism that followed a largely market-based economy with a strong welfare state, antitrust enforcement. It was a sort of bargain the ruling class made with the left as capitalism began to unravel. This is pretty spot on, I think. I want to make the point that it is this massive and militant labor movement that is the force with which the bargain was struck. Those who yearned for a return to that bargain, a deal that's really been torn to shreds by the right wing in this country in the years since, should recognize that this was a position reached by a sort of happenstance. 'Twas not what the left aimed for then, and should not be what we aim for now, even if we find all that more amenable than unrestrained neoliberal world capitalism. Anyway, gotten a little sidetracked here, because then as now there were still a bunch of actual fascists running around, and it's the response to that I really want to get to, the Popular Front. So first, just generally speaking, a Popular Front distinct from a United Front, as a broad coalition of liberal and left political groups usually, united for some common purpose. Now, usually that purpose is an actual governing coalition, or at least a group with distinct political goals, but it's almost couched either in rhetoric, fact, or both in the language of defense against a common enemy. And in 1935, the Comintern announced a new party line, the People's Front Against Fascism and War. Communists were instructed to make broad alliances with all anti-fascist parties in their countries. So basically the exact opposite of all that shit before about social fascism. They also basically legitimized all the unofficial alliances between communists, socialists, social democrats, and labor that had already begun formation in France, Spain, United States, United Kingdom. Sorry, I can't get to all of that today. In the name of stopping the world's horrible slide into fascism. Put your differences aside. Fight fascism. Should sound familiar to you. Maybe even kind of good. Well, yes and no, but mostly no. It wasn't good. I'd say I've told you less than half the story, because what the Popular Front strategy was really all about was securing a military alliance between Stalin's USSR and the countries of Western Europe and the United States. Indeed, just months before the announced strategy change, the USSR did secure such a pact with France. On the plus side, the strategy did contribute to the communists of the United States being among the first and most numerous volunteers to fight the rise of fascism in Spain in the world-famous Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the very first American military unit ever to be racially integrated. But of course, Franco did triumph in Spain in the end, and what's more, the political consequences for the left in the United States wouldn't really be so rosy. Communists who had done much to build up the labor movement now attempted to forge alliances with the middle class and enlightened bourgeoisie of the Democratic Party. It was hoped that thusly the USSR could enter into a collective security agreement with Roosevelt. What this meant in practice was running around trying to tamp down labor unrest in 1936 and 1937, keep workers from going on strike, notably in the steel and automobile industries, and offering nothing more than token electoral opposition to FDR and the Democratic Party. It also meant uncritical support of Stalin, who had some big show trials between 1936 and 1938 of pretty much every old Bolshevik. Stalin was also in the middle of imprisoning and killing millions of people, many of whom were targeted because of their nationality, religion, or ethnicity, not their politics or wealth. The Polish people of the USSR in particular were hurt pretty hard, and also the Finnish, Latvian, Estonian, Romanian people, others too. Stalin didn't pull any punches on the political repression either. Many artists, writers, and teachers were killed or sent away to the gulags. Yeah, Stalin was bad, sorry. Even if more is pinned on him than ought to be. Now, the big names and big show trials were known and reported in the West, but the hundreds of thousands of deaths and instances of imprisonment on a mass scale were mostly not, and wouldn't be for a generation, really, until the 1950s. At such a time, it will become forever a thing that the entire damn left has to answer for, till we burn through every inch of this planet. So, popular front or not, none of that's going to make communism very popular in America in the years to come, even if there's nothing inherently communist about any of that. Or as Pete Seeger once put it, quote, "I still call myself a communist because communism is no more what Russia made of it than Christianity is what the churches make of it," end quote. In addition to this, there's a larger danger, I think, that I wanted to get to. I think I'll just let Trotsky tell you about it. He did a decent job. Quote, "The theoreticians of the Popular Front do not essentially go beyond the first rule of arithmetic, that is, addition. Communists plus socialists plus anarchists plus liberals adds up to a total which is greater than their respective isolated numbers, such as all their wisdom. However, arithmetic alone does not suffice here." End quote. He continues a bit later. Quote, "A block of divergent political groups of the working class is sometimes completely indispensable for the solution of common practical problems. In certain historical circumstances, such a block is capable of attracting the oppressed petty bourgeois masses, whose interests are close to the interests of the proletariat. The joint force of such a block can prove far stronger than the sum of the forces of each of its component parts. On the contrary, the political alliance between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, whose interests on basic questions in the present epoch diverge at an angle of 180 degrees, as a general rule, is capable only of paralyzing the revolutionary force of the proletariat," end quote. Or to put it another way, this alliance, Popular Front, by forming all strategy and tactics of the left with an aim towards political alliance with some segments of capital, they were making a big mistake. This would inevitably corrupt their political goals, even if they were hoping to get into political coalitions with this strategy. In practical terms, the Popular Front did do much to put the brakes on the gains of the American labor movement, as they attempted to make nice with the Roosevelt administration, not least because Stalin felt that served his interests. But it also resulted in a ton of so-called Communist Front organizations in the United States, groups with cool names like Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee, many of which were more or less directed from Moscow, sure, but who often just had the best, most creative, most effective organizers around, especially in art, music, and letters. Anyway, let's talk about a little thing called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now, this deal between Hitler and Stalin that basically boiled down to two powers recognizing mutual spheres of influence and pledging non-aggression. Now, this deal was signed between the USSR and Germany in the August of 1939, and within the space of a few months, the party line went from being virulently anti-fascist and militant to advocating peace with Germany and a firm anti-war stance, creating a pretty big split among rank-and-file communists across the world, really, including here in the United States. Now, most people know about this pact, broken in a couple years by Hitler. Less know that the Soviet Union under Stalin and Nazi Germany were actually pretty close to getting the USSR to enter the war on the side of the Axis powers, but could never agree on the particulars. Now, disputes about how bad the communist movement suffered from all this, the most recent and drastic in what was becoming a long line of rigid and authoritarian political moves, continue to this very day. So I'm not really interested in putting a number on it. Just know that the split existed and was sizable. So after losing a lot of influence with American labor by enforcing a no-strike pledge, and a lot of influence with basically everyone on the left generally with this quick switch away from anti-fascism, the communists will bounce back quite significantly after the United States enters the war on the side of the Allied powers, at least in terms of numbers. But like Trotsky said, politics ain't arithmetic. And though the party, and therefore communism, was becoming more accepted by liberal middle classes and some labor bosses, the socialists in America were just as split as the communists by the war at first, led by a committed pacifist Presbyterian minister, whose support basically amounted to not being very anti-war. And they were fresh off expelling a bunch of Trotsky-style communists right before that. They were also not keen on making any common cause with the Stalinists or their sympathizers, making the Socialist Party of America at this time a tiny pale shadow of what it had been, it maybe could have been. They do deserve some credit for attempting, at least, to push Roosevelt to the left during the war, because they were basically the only ones trying to do it. Anyway, that's far enough, I guess. Popular Front-style politics to defeat fascism abruptly ended at the conclusion of World War II, of course. Then the Second Red Scare began in America. To be a communist was dangerous to both reputation and well-being in most of America, once again. And distinctions between communism, Stalinism, Trotskyism, socialism, democratic or otherwise, or even anarchism, basically ceased to matter very much, at least in the eyes of Uncle Sam. You were still just a damn red. Now, the left in the United States today, broadly speaking, is still pretty small. This is growing. Bernie Sanders is in the middle of his second presidential run as a self-identified democratic socialist. Positive attitudes about socialism have been trending upwards in recent years. All qualms aside about how truly socialist one thinks Senator Sanders is. Now, the Democratic Party apparatus, meanwhile, not their caucuses in the House and Senate, but the actual party machinery, is little more than a fundraising machine and legal money laundering apparatus for political consulting. I tend to think that true power on the left, or at least the potential for power, lies in the working class, both rural and urban in America. But this class is largely unorganized by the left and pretty beaten down. To be fair, the left in America has spent decades enduring the propaganda of the Popular Front's greatest weakness, the subordination of the goal of a better, more socialized, more democratic world to other forces. So, honestly, as a political movement, the Popular Front kind of sucked. Even if it did give us some of our most American-flavored communists of all time. However, as a model for limited but decisive action by coalitions of people and groups who aren't all focused on the same political goals and priorities, say, for example, if a rally of fascists in your city occurs, and a bunch of libs, communists, socialists, anarchists all agree that they need challenging, in a sort of anti-fascist front, it's actually not bad. When I began researching the Popular Front, this is why I had vaguely positive feelings towards it. For who doesn't want to support a coalition to fight fascism? But I think there's probably a reason this line of thinking has been so much on my mind. And it doesn't have as much to do with Antifa as it has to do with the Democratic primary to be president of the United States. Not a single ballot has been cast, yet it's clear from both the candidates and their surrogates, as well as our country's establishment media voices, that what they really want is a Popular Front as a political movement, one that they control through arithmetic. You don't want the fascists to win because of your obsession with political purity. Stalinists argued then, and the hashtag resistance argues now. Yes, you heard me right. I'm comparing the libs to Stalin. But in all seriousness, is there any doubt that the radical energy the communists gathered in America throughout the 20s and 30s through their efforts to democratize the shop floor and the sharecroppers' field took a serious hit when that activism ceased in an attempt to appease liberals and social democrats? What thanks was waiting for them when the war ended anyway? Paranoia, persecution by those same liberals and social democrats of the ruling class of the United States in the Republican and Democratic parties. Anyway, beware of serious people clinging to the rotted apparatus of a system who preach unity at precisely the time when the fight for what the party will be is and should be taking place. To those with less influence and power in our world who are nonetheless convinced of this line of thinking, I would suggest the following retort: unity, yes, on the left's terms. Socialism is the only surefire cure for fascism, which is itself just the herpes of capitalism gone untreated. Energizing and expanding the electorate beyond the traditional targets of the Democratic Party and ignoring those mythical swing voters and moderate suburban Republicans must be the strategy. And you do that by offering people a better world, one that works to reduce income inequality, redistribute wealth downward, socialize medicine, expand union membership and political freedoms, among other things. You don't need a bunch of fancy theory to figure this out, because the experiment has been run. The results are in, and Uncle Sam has fascist herpes. Those voices who have in the past endlessly insisted that the left support a liberal capitalist project, access to health care, should consider that that project is done one way or another, and that if they don't want to see the world burn, we're the only game in town. Thank you for listening. Yeah, I know the left today is not really exactly like the communists of the 30s. And that there's no Moscow party apparatus commanding us about, but just thought maybe some of this stuff was a little bit interesting and something to think about. See you